Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest in the series of webinars from WorkLifePsych. This time it's all about getting to grips with imposter syndrome, a phrase you may have come across before, something that you maybe identify with as an individual. So today my goal is to really explain what this is and give you some tips on dealing with it in a more positive and sustainable way. I'm Richard MacKinnon. If you've come to any of the webinars before, I'm sure you've got used to seeing this slide. I'm a workplace psychologist, and I founded WorkLifePsych, the business that I run 6 years ago. And I'm going to make reference to our podcast a little bit later on because just in the last month, we've done 2 episodes all about this topic. So I'll signpost those at the end of the session. That's called my Pocket Psych. And we have some additional webinars added to the schedule over the next few weeks. In a couple of weeks' time, I'm going to be doing a session on how to deal with overwhelm when it all feels a bit too much, and particularly relevant at the moment when many people are working at home and multiple difficulties are happening at the same time. And a couple of weeks after that, continuing a theme, we're going to look at the concept of work-life harmony. That's the phrase I use over work-life balance, and I'll explain a lot more about that on the day. You can find the details of all the webinars and all future events at worklifepsych.com/webinars. So today I want to clarify what I mean by imposter syndrome, give you some examples of the thoughts and the feelings that go along with that. Talk a little bit about its origins, although there's no one clear reason why any of us might experience this from time to time. And I want to talk about the impact, because the impact isn't always obvious. And in fact, when we're experiencing imposter syndrome, the impacts can come out in some quite unexpected ways. So maybe some things to look out for in yourself and in the people around you. And of course, I want to spend a good bit of time exploring what it is that we can do about it. But before we go any further, I'd like you to take a moment. Ask yourself why you're here today. Why have you registered for this? What about this session or your anticipation about this session brings you here today to give up your time to learn a little bit more about imposter syndrome? Is this something that you can identify with? Is it something that you think you've experienced in the past? And really importantly, how have you tried to deal with it? How successful was that? Did it work for you well? Or was it more like a sticking plaster? And also, is this a constant experience or one that comes and goes? And you could maybe identify some themes. Maybe it appears at particular times. Maybe it appears when you're around particular people. For most of us, if we experience imposter syndrome, it's not something that is permanently on our minds. And in fact, as discussed on the podcast recently, you could challenge the whole idea of this being a syndrome because so many people experience these kinds of thoughts and feelings so regularly. So is it something that is quite special? Not really. And it's probably worth making a clear differentiation between occasional self-doubt, occasional doubts about your competence, which can be helpful, and imposter syndrome, which is the kind of thing that can really prevent you from being your best self. And as I'll explain, some of the impacts of that can really have knock-on effects that are best avoided. Now, as we go through today, I'd really like to hear from you. So we have a Q&A capability on Zoom. Do drop your questions or your comments into that. I'll keep one eye on it, and I'll pause every so often to check in with you. But if I do see a question, I'll stop there. I'll do my best to answer it. Why are we looking at imposter syndrome right now? It's a topic, in my experience, that's coming up more and more in the coaching context. So many of the people that I'm working with one-on-one in a coaching context report these kinds of thoughts and feelings. In addition, we've seen that the context many people are working in right now, a kind of enforced non-workplace based work, effectively working at home when they really didn't ask for it, that can lead to worries about competence, worries about fitting in, worries about what other people are thinking about us when we're not all in the same space. And that's very like imposter syndrome. So people who maybe had some low-lying doubts about their capabilities and how they fit in, they could really have that augmented by the experience that they're going through at the moment. It's also a phrase that's used a lot. So let's make the distinction between that self-doubt, worries about what other people think of us from time to time, and the kind of imposter syndrome that really stops us from being our best selves and maybe convinces us not to put our hands up for opportunities, prevents us from acknowledging our successes. It's a really uncomfortable, it's a really disruptive experience. So let's talk a little bit about what it actually is. I've yet to find one really perfect and inclusive definition for this. And of course, it's not a diagnostic label in the world of mental health, but it's a really well-recognized cluster of thoughts, beliefs, and behaviors. So some of the things that we see coming up, this sort of intellectual self-doubt, I'm not smart enough, I'm not good enough to cope with what I'm doing, I don't have the skills that are needed. When we do experience a success, we might then attribute that to luck. You know, it's nothing to do with me. I just happen to be the right person at the right time. I'm not good. I'm not special. It all worked out for me. You know, I'm lucky. There's also many times an overriding fear or anxiety about somehow being found out, somehow being exposed as if you're being a fraud. And that turns into all kinds of worries about any day now, I'll make a mistake. And that is the mistake that people will jump on and say, see, he knows nothing about this. Or look, she is not good enough. We need to get rid of her. And so it's not just that I wonder if I'm as good as I could be. It's I'm a fraud. I'm definitely not good enough. And I'm only just holding on here by the skin of my teeth. And when we experience success and we are experiencing imposter syndrome, it's very difficult for us to acknowledge that and internalize that success. There's an inner dialogue that says, oh, if only you knew how close to failure I got, you wouldn't be telling me well done, and so on. And so an overarching theme there of inadequacy. Now, that doesn't sound nice at all. And the knock-on effects of this kind of thinking and these emotions can be really quite severe and debilitating, but at the very minimum, they can really prevent people from enjoying work, from enjoying their successes, but also from having a realistic appraisal of themselves. It's a very simplified appraisal of self that is very black and white, very categorical. So what I'd like you to do is maybe take a moment and think about what your own imposter sounds like. What does he or she tell you? That you're not good enough, that you're one mistake away from losing it all, that you're just lucky. Have a think about that, because one of the things we'll return to a little bit later on is the benefit of acknowledging these thoughts rather than trying to change them or push them away. I really like this quote, not so much a definition, but a way of describing it by Russ Harris, the author of The Happiness Trap. Really great writer if you've never encountered any of his stuff. But his focus here is what do we do with our attention? And he points out that people with imposter syndrome are not paying enough attention to their direct experience, to the clearly observable facts that they are doing their job effectively. Instead, they're paying attention to an overcritical mind that says you don't know what you're doing. So on the one hand, it's about what do we pay attention to? And actually, how do we weigh up the evidence? Do we look at the facts around us? Do we look at the feedback we get from others? Or do we discount all of that and only focus on that little voice inside that tells us we're not good enough? Well, when we're experiencing imposter syndrome, we give far too much attention to that little voice, and we allow that voice to dictate our awareness and, in some ways, our behavior. So where does all this come from? There's no one route through which we develop imposter syndrome, but there's a few critical factors that have been identified. The first of these, ironically, is perfectionism. So if people have an overwhelming urge to get everything right and that things must be perfect, and you can already see, of course, that that's unattainable, that any criticism of their output, of their work, of their behavior, any criticism of any aspect of them their timekeeping, their dress sense, is viewed as a critique of them as a person, and it's success versus failure. There's no shades of gray in between the two. And so someone with this drive for perfectionism will see every bit of feedback and every setback as a disaster and not good enough. And it's important to make that distinction between my work, my outputs, and me. My outputs can have many errors in them. That doesn't mean I'm a bad person. But with perfectionism, we tie those things together in a very unhelpful way. We can also, as I've just indicated, give too much credence to our inner critic. We can pay too much attention to that voice that tells us how we're not good enough. Now, the inner critic is something that everybody has, and they'll be aware of it to varying degrees, and it will get in the way to varying degrees. But I want to make a distinction between an inner critic that tells you you're not good enough versus your reflections on how you might be better. Reflections that give you an idea of how you could improve your performance. Reflections where you're honest with yourself and say, I did mess up there. I made a big mistake or even a small mistake, versus the critic that again conflates you with your mistakes, with your work, and criticizes you as a person rather than the work, the activity, the outputs. Something that's common to a lot of people when they experience imposter syndrome is a very oversimplified self-concept. So it's very healthy for us to have a detailed understanding and appraisal of ourselves, to see us as being made up of so many millions of different facets that it's impossible to describe ourselves in any great detail and yet simply. Because there's so much of us. There's our physical attributes, our personality, our life experience, our motivational factors, our likes, our dislikes, our skills. There's so much of it there. And so many of those things can be viewed positively. Some we can view negatively, or others might view negatively, and lots of them are very neutral. However, if we have an oversimplified self-concept, it can sound a little bit like, I'm as good as the last piece of feedback that I got. I'm as good as the last sale I made. I'm as good as the last day when I didn't make any mistakes. And so you can see that is a gross oversimplification and will make you feel awful because everyone makes mistakes. Everyone is human and therefore fallible. And this oversimplified concept, self-concept will really sound a little bit like wearing a badge. I am ... And there isn't a badge big enough to accurately describe any of us without oversimplifying us and without leading us down this route of I am ... and not feeling good about it. Now, something that we know that can contribute to the experience of imposter syndrome is being in a minority. And I put the word contextual in there because you could be a minority in a context and then outside of that context, not necessarily a minority. And when psychologists began to research this concept back in the 70s, they were very clear that they believed that imposter syndrome was something that only women experienced. And subsequent research, of course, has demonstrated that anyone can experience it. But what they may have been tapping into was the experience of being a minority. So for a lot of those women, a woman in an overwhelmingly male work environment, for example. But if you're any kind of a minority in a work environment or any other kind of context, no matter who you are or what you are, if you feel yourself as a minority, that may well play into your feelings of imposter syndrome. And of course, these aren't separate issues. So it may drive a bit of perfectionism there, or it may lead you to view yourself a little bit too simply. I am an outsider. I don't deserve this job. I'm here out of luck. And of course, there are some developmental factors. And not all of these will happen concurrently, but if you've had inconsistent feedback, if you've had feedback from parental figures that has been about attainment of success and respect and love have been contingent on success, you may well have internalized some of those lessons. I am good when I win. I am good when I get good grades. I am good when I get a great job, or I'm a good person if I'm a member of a specific profession. Again, oversimplification of the self and a very black and white or categorical view of life. And There's very few times that that's actually helpful when we're thinking about ourselves or indeed other people at all. I'm going to pause at this point and just check if anyone has any questions or comments. Please feel free to drop them into the Q&A box there. I'll have a look, and I'll give you a moment to type them in and pause while we're waiting. It may be the fact, of course, that you have a good understanding yourself as to where your imposter syndrome originated. And if it's not on the list, that doesn't mean you're wrong. It means you've got another perspective. This, of course, like pretty much any list I ever share, is not finite. Just some headlines to get us thinking about this topic. And on the podcast a couple of weeks ago, during an interview with Dr. Rachel Skews, another psychologist who is very familiar with this concept, we shared our own examples, to illustrate the kind of humanity involved. And my example was ending my Viva exam for my doctorate. So I defended my dissertation, left the room, was called back in 15 minutes, 20 minutes later. I don't really remember. I was in the wind tunnel of anxiety, told that I'd passed. And my first thought was, well, that's obviously a mistake. They're obviously wrong. I can't have passed. Let's see how wrong they are. So there was no ability to say, wow, I'm so grateful it's all over, or wow, I'm glad that this has been acknowledged, or this success has been acknowledged by experts. And it's really easy for us to discount those positive, to discount those wins. And in doing so, we play down our own effort, our skills, the investment that we've made in whatever we're doing. So, quick question there. How is this different from what's traditionally called an inferiority complex? So I suppose here we're talking about something, that's a really good question. We're talking about something here that's really about the workplace. This is traditionally viewed in the context of work and roles. And the imposter syndrome is specifically about not believing you're good enough for that role, that position, the job, and not believing that the feedback you're getting about your performance is good enough. And in fact, I'm not aware of phrases like inferiority complex being used in the context where I work as a coaching psychology. I try and avoid labels like that. And in fact, I don't apply labels like this to the people I work with. They might come in the door talking about their imposter syndrome. Labels are rarely helpful, but we can talk about thinking style and we can talk about behaviors, but we don't want to label a person. I hope that makes sense. So let's talk a little bit about the impact. And if you're someone that can identify with this, you're probably really aware of how unpleasant it is and how much you don't want this. But what we do know is that the impact can spread out and be something that has impacts outside of what we would immediately think of, things like happiness and satisfaction at work. So let's have a look at some of those things and how they relate to each other. So when we're feeling, I don't deserve this, I'm not good enough, I'm going to be found out, that's a lot of pressure on us. And so we have that anxiety, we have that worry that we'll be found out, or our next mistake will literally be our last because then we'll lose our job. And that anxiety and worry is not rational. It's not because you've been told you can only make one more mistake. None of this is based on rational thought where you've had the feedback that's specific enough that you could agree with it. This exists in our minds and it's not based in reality. So anxiety and worry, they're tiring. They take our focus away from where it might else be useful to focus, and they're unpleasant states, and they in turn can drive other things. We can, especially if there's an element of perfectionism here, engage in some unsustainable striving. That's the really hard work to prove that we're worth it. But it's not been asked of us. It's far beyond going the extra mile. It's going way above and beyond and really, really, really throwing ourselves into our work in a way that is unsustainable. And that could have knock-on effects to our physical well-being as well as our psychological health. We may, as a result of that, or just because of the worry and the anxiety, engage in unsustainable coping strategies. And unsustainable coping, if you've been to the coping webinar, is anything that you do that really can't be done over the medium to long term. Any coping strategy that you engage in that could detract from your well-being over time. And that could involve substance use. It could involve avoiding certain situations because you can't avoid them forever, avoiding certain people. And in fact, the unsustainable striving, you could, in a sense, say that's a kind of a coping strategy. But anything we do in response to difficulties, we could call coping. And some of the coping we do is excellent and really useful. The unsustainable nature of these is what takes away, what wears away at our well-being. A very common response is also procrastination, which is very interesting. But if you think about it, if we're very worried about our performance, our procrastinating mind says, if you don't make a start on this, you can't do badly on it. And that doesn't make sense. If you push this activity into the future, you won't have to experience it yet. And if I push it away from me, if I push this into the future, well, then I can't fail and I don't have to deal with it. But of course, it's procrastination. There's a point at which we will have to deal with it. And that can increase our anxiety, our worry, our feelings of stress. And again, not a very sustainable response. But at the time, it makes perfect sense to us. So quick tip, a way to spot procrastination is probably the instant relief that your decision brings. I'll do that tomorrow. I'll do that next week. If you get a lot of relief with that, it's possibly time to take an honest look at that decision-making process. It can also have an impact on relationships in the workplace and outside of the workplace. If you're experiencing a lot of anxiety and you're engaging in these long working hours and really going way above and beyond, you will not have the time and attention to dedicate to your personal relationships, whether they're family, romantic, friendships, however it might be. And of course, some of that demandingness, some of those high standards, that perfectionism, or some of the procrastination behaviors can also take away from workplace relationships and the quality that is experienced there. Because procrastination can drive stress, which can drive some emotional outbursts. Anxiety can do the same. So all in all, when we engage in this, we may not be the kind of person that other people really enjoy working with. And as an overarching theme, it can really dent our self-confidence. And what that means is we're less likely to put ourselves forward for things that we're well able to do. Joining a project team, leading a project team, putting our hand up for different responsibilities, putting our hat in the ring for a new job. All of these are out of reach because we're listening to that voice that says, you're not good enough, that oversimplified view of ourselves. No matter how the impact manifests, no matter what shows up in our behavior as a result of this, the fundamental fact is that it's taking us away from what matters to us. If we're battling anxiety, rather than doing something helpful for anxiety, or if we're chronically procrastinating, the resulting impact of that means that we're not able to give the time and attention to the things that, from a values perspective, we think are important to us in life. So the harsh inner critic, the feelings that you're not good enough, they're not just thoughts and feelings. They have an impact on our behavior and they have an impact on our focus. And as I mentioned earlier with the Russ Harris quote, it's all about what we pay attention to. So let's talk about what we might do about this experience. An important thing to note here is that maybe what you've tried before didn't work, but you couldn't think of something else to do. So you kept doing that thing. Maybe you argued with your own mind. Maybe you denied those thoughts. Maybe what you've tried to do is really double down and engage in some of that very strenuous work and those extra long hours to kind of prove yourself to yourself and to other people. Maybe you've found yourself debating with that inner critic. Well, whatever it is, I'd encourage you to be open to trying something else at this point. If this is still something that's interfering with your satisfaction, your enjoyment of work, and so on. But when we talk about beating this, unfortunately, we're not really talking about getting rid of the thoughts that we'd associate with it. The focus on getting rid of thoughts is a distraction and it's unsustainable, but by trying to remove thoughts, we're in a sense really further embedding them in our minds. They just become stronger the more that we try and get rid of them. So don't view this as an exercise in removing anything that sounds like imposter syndrome from your mind. It's also not about feeling more confident or feeling capable and then taking action. There's 2 points to make here. A lot of the time we'll hold ourselves back and say, when I feel confident, I will do that thing. Well, it's kind of the cart before the horse here. It's not about feeling the confidence and then doing it. It's really about doing the thing and then getting the confidence as a result of having done the thing. And so what we're going to focus on is not the feelings and the thoughts. It's about what we do and taking effective action day to day. And overwhelmingly, and maybe contrary to a lot of pop psychology, it's not about just simply thinking positive thoughts, because that's a form of arguing with your own mind. You're not worth it. Oh, yes, I am. I'm brilliant. You don't deserve this job. Oh, I'm the absolute best candidate for the job. What are you doing there? You're kind of arm wrestling with an argumentative mind. And while you're doing that, you're not bringing your focus to the things that are important to you. You're getting caught up in your own thoughts. So instead, we're going to develop a different relationship with our thoughts. And if you remember nothing else from this session, remember that this is about seeing thoughts for what they actually are, not what they say they are. We have so many millions of thoughts each day. We cannot keep track of them. But with imposter syndrome, some of these thoughts really stand out to us and we treat them as truths, as absolute facts, when in fact many of them are nothing like that. If they came from another human being, we might think of them as opinions, perhaps beliefs, but not facts. Sometimes they can sound like threats. Sometimes they can be very strong predictions. But the point is, if we can see them as thoughts, passing, transient mental experiences, then we can have a different relationship with them. We don't need to remove them. We don't need to change them. We don't need to try and crank up different emotions. We can just let them pass by. And so instead of trying to get stuck into a struggle about what we should believe about ourselves and what we should think and should not think, we give up that struggle. If it was a tug of war, we would drop the rope. We wouldn't try and win. And instead, we focus on what we do. We take action that's helpful for ourselves in line with what we believe is important, our values. So really, to beat the imposter syndrome, it's not about changing our thoughts, changing our emotions, changing our self-regard. It's about doing stuff that's important to us. And as a result, the thoughts are less loud, less intrusive. As a result of taking helpful action, we may feel more confident. We may feel less self-effacing and critical of our own abilities. And we may indeed have more positive thoughts, but that's not the goal. The goal is to do important stuff that's meaningful to us rather than arm wrestle this inner critic into submission. Let's talk about some of those methods. Hopefully that made sense. And it can be a bit difficult because admittedly what we do naturally when we think of something that we don't like is to try and do something with that thought. It's thought as problem, so I need to solve the problem, rather than, well, it's a thought, I let it go. So a thought is just a thought. But what can we do about all of this? Well, one of the first things is about noticing, paying attention to now. Noticing that you're having the thoughts. And that doesn't mean letting them take over, but just acknowledging them as thoughts. So a thought is just a thought, not a command, not a threat, not a fact. It's just a thought. And there'll be another one and another one and another one. So if you can just see these self-critiquing thoughts as just more of the same stuff that our mind is producing constantly, it can take some of their power away. We also don't want to get rid of them. They're part of who we are. We have many thoughts that we don't want, but thoughts don't make us who we are. If I have a thought, I don't act on it, but it could be a very uncomfortable thought about, I don't know, having a fight with someone. It's not happened, but I've imagined the argument. I've imagined the strong words. That doesn't make me a bad person. That just means my mind has given me some thoughts about something that hasn't even happened. Likewise, if I have thoughts about my own competence and I go from a client telling me there was a mistake in a report, and then my mind takes me all the way through to I don't have a job anymore in a split second, that doesn't make me a failure. It makes really clear I have an active imagination, but it's not the same as who I am. Now, we don't want to get rid of them, so we just want to make some space for these thoughts. Let them be. When we struggle with them, we give them power, we give them attention, they take over our awareness, and then we're wrestling with them. A very useful approach, and it's part of a skill set called diffusion, is about naming the story you're telling yourself, or there may be more than one. So when you encounter these thoughts, it can be a case of you saying to yourself, oh, here we go. Here's the I'm not good enough story. I've heard this one before. Or, oh yes, it's the I'm about to lose my job story. Or I just won this by luck story. Yeah. So if you can listen out for, notice the trends in this kind of self-criticism, you can see it as another story and another one and another one. And by treating it like a story, treating it with a little bit of disdain, a little bit of maybe eye rolling, as you might if a colleague kept telling you the same story about their childhood over and over again, you might say, oh, here we go. It's the I was a gold medal track finalist. Well, you can name these. Now, you're not saying they're not true. You're not saying they are true. You're not getting rid of them. You're just sort of discounting the power that they have over you. And this process of diffusion allows you to put some space between you and the thought. You still have the thought, but it's not front and center. It's not that you're looking through it anymore. You can see the thought, but you can also see the world a lot more clearly by not looking through that thought, that very basic self-evaluation that tells you you're not good enough. And a really good technique, and something that I see working really well, in addition to these diffusion activities in coaching, is working on developing a much more detailed view of yourself. Instead of attaching your self-worth to a job title, to the quality of your work, to the last piece of feedback you get, to something that's even not attainable like perfection, see yourself as made up of so many more things. Identify, and I'd encourage you to do this with a pen and a piece of paper. Take some time to identify lots of your positive attributes. But at the same time, identify some of your negative attributes, or some of the things that the people who know you really well might say were your down points, things that you might want to work on, or aspects of you that they didn't particularly enjoy. And so those things could be, I'm a really great project manager, but I can be quite demanding of people sometimes. I'm a really good public speaker, but from time to time I over-prepare for my speaking events. Okay, so you're getting a view. It doesn't have to be balanced, but you're looking at the positive aspects and some of the negative aspects, and then you can add to that with some neutral things. It's not relevant to work at all, but I make a really good lasagna. I'm excellent at parallel parking. I like to travel, right? So the more you can see of yourself as being made up of lots of facets, when one of those facets is critiqued, attacked, dented, if you like, you can say, yes, I do tend to over-prepare, and I'm good at this, I'm positive about this, and I make a lasagna. The point being that we're made up of so many of these things. If one of them is attacked, if one of them is threatened, it doesn't make us bad, and we're able to see ourselves with a lot more detail and appraise our abilities in a very realistic and much more helpful way. So moving from good, bad, success, failure, to there's lots of me going on here. Some of it's going really well, some of it's less well, and I've got stuff I can work on, and there's stuff that I could always be better at. But that's much more realistic than the black and white, good, bad, success, failure. And in fact, whenever I'm asked to talk about success or write about success, it's one of the things that I kind of jump on immediately and say, it's not a very helpful term, because it implies that you are one of two things, successful or unsuccessful. And if you're experiencing success, it can be quite a transient phase. And if you're not experiencing it, then you're worried about your lack of success. And that's a sort of an unsustainable striving in and of itself. So if we're going to grade ourselves, let's get specific. Don't grade us as human beings as people, grade ourselves on our abilities, think about what we can do better, think about the feedback that we get and see what is actually actionable, and move away from the difference between sort of what we call big I versus little I. Big I, oversimplified views of self. I'm as good as my last sale, versus little I. I'm actually made up of lots and lots and lots of small things, some positive, some negative, some neutral. And finally, on this list, I'd really advocate, and because it works, but it's something to really help you get in touch with what's important to you, your values. Your values, those enduring attributes or aspects of you that you want more of. Things like professionalism, things like family focus, like compassion, patience, fun and adventure. They can be anything as long as they're not a goal. And that's a whole different session, but we did a webinar on values, and you can find that on the YouTube channel. But if you use your values to guide your actions, what you're doing is not removing thoughts and emotions from the equation, but you're saying, I'm thinking this, I'm feeling this, and at the same time, I know it's important. I'm feeling I'm not good enough. I'm really feeling anxious about my performance. And yet I know that it's something I believe in to put my hand up and make this contribution, to put my name forward for the job, to ask for feedback, to take a risk, because that's what's important to me in life. And that's why values are so useful to us. It's what matters to us. Fleeting thoughts from an internal self-concept or self-critic are not as helpful to us and not as enduring and not who we want to be. So the most important points I want to make here are that a thought is just a thought, and we don't have to be led by the thoughts and emotions that spring up from time to time. Instead, getting in touch with what matters to us and using the values to guide what it is that we do is much more important and much more useful to us than trying to extinguish thoughts, turn down the volume of thoughts, alter the thoughts so that they're positive. None of that works. And it takes up a lot of time and a lot of energy, and ultimately leaves us back to square one. So I want to share some more resources with you. I mentioned that at the very start of the session. We did 2 episodes very recently, 72 and 73 of my Pocket Psych, all about this topic. We've got one with my co-host Pilar Ortiz and one with Dr. Rachel Skews, all about the different ways that this can show up, and one in particular about the working at home experience. So you might find that useful. And the recording of this session is going to be put on our YouTube channel. You can find it there, worklifepsych.com/YouTube. All of our webinars go on there and will go on there. As you probably experienced this afternoon, they're not Hollywood productions, but it's a useful way to go back and revisit this stuff. And if you found it useful, an easy way to share it with people that you think might find that useful. Now, come back to us if you've got questions about anything that I've discussed today. If you want to have a think about it, you can just send a message at My Pocket Psych on Twitter, or indeed drop me an email via the sign up for this webinar. But we have some time, so I'd really like to open it up. Are there any other questions anyone would like to ask, or points you'd like to make at this time? While we wait for those questions to come through, I'd just like to thank everyone for joining this afternoon. It's not always easy to find the time for these kinds of events. That's why we try and keep them relatively short. I hope today I've introduced another perspective on imposter syndrome, giving you some food for thought, and allowed you to go and have a look at different ways of dealing with your own experience of it. One final thing will be to say, trying to avoid labeling yourself and instead focus on labeling a behavior, labeling a thought, labeling an emotion. Much more useful, and it helps you move away from those global, sticky labels that we can attach to ourselves from time to time. Any tips for overcoming the fear of perfectionism to get started on something? Yeah, so a lot of the advice I might give for procrastination really also applies to perfectionism, because what we're trying to do is attain the impossible by doing something perfectly. So perfectionism can be dealt with, first of all, by taking the work that we need to do and slicing it up into the smallest parts possible. And that means that we're not looking to perfect a thing, we're looking to do our best on a series of small tasks. And that allows us to just make a start. And the thing about it is, once we've made a start on it, it's harder to stop. We remove the inertia of anxiety and fear. Again, perfectionism can also be dealt with by getting input from others and getting feedback from others and having an accountability buddy who could work with you to point out when enough is enough and when standards have been met. It's very useful to look at some of that external evidence to point to what is required here, and making that agreement with yourself as to what you're going to do rather than leave the open door so that you have an unlimited amount of time and energy you can put into something. So giving yourself a budget of time, a budget of energy to put into something. But perfectionism is associated with anxiety about getting something wrong. So ask yourself the fundamental question here: what's the worst that could happen? And that can often deflate those fears a little bit. The worst that could happen is that someone gives me feedback about how I can do better. The worst that could happen is that my manager takes me aside and says, you need to proof your documents better. Think about the worst. And if that's the worst that you could experience, you can make a start. I hope that answers that question there. Another question popped up. I always second doubt myself, especially in work. I struggle with getting my point across. Any tips to slow it down so I can get my words out correctly and say what I want to in a confident way? Yeah, that sounds tough. And it sounds a lot like the experience we have when we've got a busy mind and we know in our heads maybe what we want to get across, but it's difficult to actually deliver it. So without knowing all of the details of your own situation, a couple of things I might suggest. One is preparation and rehearsal of what it is that you want to say, making notes so that you can, because we cannot write as quickly as we can think. So actually writing things down can help slow us down. And also thinking about the key points that you want to make rather than having a script, because that can limit our creativity in the moment. So if you use different words to the words you intended, but you still make your point, that's a win. So again, it's not about perfection. And of course, taking a couple of deep breaths before you speak gives you a chance to settle your mind. And also, my final point would be, when we have this experience, we often overestimate the passing of time in a conversation. So use pauses, use silence to your advantage, because it gives others a chance to think, it gives you a chance to think. Don't feel that you're under time pressure. Another question just popped up there. I feel fairly comfortable in large areas of my job, but have real fear about being exposed if I were to move to a new job or company. So this is core to this experience of imposter syndrome, the fear of being exposed, found out. I might suggest, again, without knowing everything about you and your context there, one of the things is about getting specific about what's required of you in your job and in any new jobs that you might be interested in. So that's about the skills, the competencies, the interpersonal skills, the industry knowledge, qualifications. If you're able to get specific about those things, you're moving away from I'm good enough, I'm not good enough, through to I have these skills, I have these qualifications, maybe this is some more industry experience I need, but you're breaking it down into actionable detail. The longer you are in a role, the more scary it can feel to get out of that role and go and do something new. It represents a change, and it's a very throwaway line, but it will feel strange if it's a change. So there's going to be a level of discomfort with any change. Think as rationally as you can about what you've got going for you now, and be specific about what you want to work on to get where you want to be. Thanks for those questions, everyone. Really good. I hope the answers gave you some pointers. It's always a challenge when you A, can't see someone, B, you know nothing about them, but I hope those were sufficiently detailed for you. We've got time for maybe one more question if anyone wants to drop something in before we wrap up. Okay, I'm not seeing anything appear in the chat box or the Q&A. So let me wrap up now by thanking you all again. I hope you found it useful. The recording will be on our YouTube channel shortly. Feel free to share that, revisit it, and come back with questions at any point. Thanks again for joining me this afternoon.